Okay, hello everyone. I'm just going to do a short series of videos to sort of go over what we've gone over in lessons, because trying to do step-by-step things in a PowerPoint can easily get lost in translation, and it's a lot of writing for something that may not make a tremendous amount of sense. So I'm going to do a series of short videos, basically going over what we've gone over in lessons, and hopefully these will be helpful. So, as always, if we're going to be doing a new project, we're going to use a blank games project. While we're at college, we do this just because it's the fastest one to load from scratch when you start up the computer. If you wanted in your own time to experiment with any of the others, feel free. All of the ones in games are naturally built for games. So we've got first person, third person, etc. This is if you want to experiment in making games. If you wanted to look more into the VFX and film side of things, there is the film, video, and live events. This has things for virtual production. DMX is for events and stage shows, and then in-camera VFX again is for like virtual production, shooting on an LED volume. It's just another version of it. So for this one, I'm going to use a blank games project, and I will come back to you when it's loaded. Okay, we're all loaded up into a blank games project. We are going to get any random windows out of the way, and I'm going to just make sure everything is back to default. So, obviously, as we go over in lessons, this is oftentimes what your Unreal Engine will look like before you've changed anything. I always advise you to open up the content drawer or the content browser drawer, and the best way to do that is to open it from the bottom left, go to dock in layout, and then yours will either dock like this and just be a part of the layout, or if yours opens as a totally separate window like this, then you can drag from any tab, and if you drag from the tab's name, we will get the docking layout active, and we can just dock it to the bottom of the screen and maybe make it a little bit smaller just so we can see what we're doing. Cool. So this is the default layout. So obviously we have our default landscape with some mountains. If we hold right click while we are hovered over the viewport, we can move the camera around, and then while we're still holding right click, you can use W, A, S, and D as arrow keys. And if we get a bit closer to the ground so we've got some more perspective, you'll see we can move around just like in a video game that you'd play on any computer. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is take a quick look at how to add things. We're going to look at the layout, and we are going to look at some lighting just like we did in the first lesson. So for the layout, let's have a quick look over on the right hand side. So the first piece that I want you all to be aware of is the outliner. So up here at the top right, this is the outliner. It works like any other outliner in Maya. If you've got any experience with Blender, it works the same as that. So this holds all of our different objects that we have in our scene. So for us, we only really have some lighting that was default in there, and we have a landscape as well, which if we click on any piece of this landscape, it will show us that piece in the outliner. We also have just underneath, just under where I am, if I move myself, we have just here in the bottom right hand corner the details panel. Now the details panel is basically where we edit the settings of things. So if I click on our directional light, we will see all of the light settings. So we've got the light intensity, light color, source angle, etc, etc. There are usually quite a lot of settings in this menu for pretty much any object that you import in. So having a play around with them, trying to break them, it's never a bad thing. Just remember, always undo or maybe make a copy of the thing that you're messing around with, just so you can get back to where you want to be. Cool. So now we've got those out of the way. Our main area here, as we can see from this tab up in the top corner, is called the viewport. So the viewport is basically where we look around, where we see what we are creating. And then in the bottom, of course, we have the content browser, and this is where we find any and all of our content. So any materials, any shaders, any imported models or assets, anything. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is look at adding basic objects. So up over on the top, we have the quick add menu. So the easiest way to remember how to add something is we've got a green plus. It's an add button. So look for the green plus, click on the down arrow, and this is where we get all of our basically categories from which we can add things. So for now, we're just going to go into shapes and add some primitives. So we've got a cube, sphere, cylinder, cone, and plane, which you may recognize from Maya or Blender if that's what you're more used to. So if we just get a cube in real quick, and this is our cube. So it will always import whatever shape you click on right in front of your camera. So it won't import it in a set position in the world. It won't import it into the world origin, so 0, 0, 0. It will just do it in front of your camera. So if you're ever super zoomed out and you add something in, a lot of the time people will think, oh, look at this cube, it's enormous. But no, it's actually just right in front of our camera. So if we go back to our original cube, so to do that, if you ever want to zoom in on anything, if you select it, so it's got the orange outline, and press F on the keyboard, F will full screen your selection. It's an easy way to navigate around the world. Now, with this cube, we've got our little gizmo already, and we're currently set to the move tool. And we can see that by our 3 arrows. And if we click and drag on those, it moves around. Now, the hotkeys for the move, rotation, scale tool are exactly the same as in Maya. So currently we're in the move tool. If we press E, we go to the rotate tool and we can rotate around. Or if we press R, we'll go to the scale tool where we can scale. So everything works in the exact same way as Maya. Now, I'll press W to go back to the move tool. By default, snapping is enabled in Unreal Engine. And what this means is every time we pull on this arrow, we'll see if I make really small movements, it won't move constantly. It snaps. And currently, that snapping is set to 10 units. So we can see that up here at the top right of the viewport. We have these 3 buttons that are all highlighted in blue. So the first one, which looks like a grid, is our move snapping. And we can see the amount of units that it's set to. So with that enabled, if I click on the 10 and set that to 100, and then I move again, we'll see it snaps in much larger amounts. Now, if we set that back to 10, and I click on the blue grid and turn it grey, we no longer have snapping enabled. We are free to move this wherever we want. The same goes for rotation. Currently I can only rotate in increments of 10 degrees. I can turn that off and I can rotate however much I like. And then scale, the same thing. It will go in increments of 0.25, or if I turn it off, we can do it with as much precision as we like. Awesome. Now, one quick tip, which a lot of you ask me to remind you of in lessons. If you ever want to perfectly get something on the ground, you just float it above where you want it, make sure it's selected, so it's highlighted in orange, and then press the end key on your keyboard, so just above the up arrow. And it will fall, and it will land on whatever it hits first, and it will perfectly sit on that platform. Awesome. So, that is how we manipulate an object, how we add a basic shape, and also how we snap it to the ground. Now, let's play with some lighting, like we did in the first session. So, if we go back to our quick add menu, and this time we come down to lights, you'll see we've got a few different types of lights. So the first one is directional light. Now, if you noticed earlier in the outliner, we already have a directional light in our scene. So the directional light basically mimics the sun. And the reason for this is it is an infinite light, so it's up there behind the clouds currently. And that infinite light means that whatever direction it's pointing in, it will cast light across the entire world in that direction. It won't have a cone, it won't have a sphere for which it affects. It is infinite across the entire world. And it is also a parallel light. Now, parallel lighting is hard to explain because the only source we actually have of parallel lighting in real life is the sun. If you want to look into it and research a bit into it, it is a fairly interesting topic of how we can create man-made parallel light. But it basically means that every single beam of light that's coming down here is going in the exact same direction. It doesn't cast outwards from a point. It all goes in one direction, which we'll compare to our point light in just a minute. Now, I'm going to quickly hide my volumetric clouds just so we can see that sun. Now, the easiest way to move that sun, and the most intuitive way I find, is if you hold Control and then hold L at the same time on the keyboard. And while we're holding them, we'll see this little gizmo appear, and it looks like a compass almost, a 3D compass. And we'll see there's a little arrow that's currently pointing up towards the sun. Now, if you move your mouse, we'll see that arrow moves and the sun will go in whatever direction that arrow is pointing. If we put it really high in the sky, we get a very harsh and a very white light. If we put it lower in the sky, it will automatically act as if it is the dawn, and that light starts to turn into almost like a golden hour light. So it starts to get very, very warm lighting, so very orange. And it also makes those shadows a lot longer due to the angle of the sun. So I've just let go of Control and L so that I can hover around my environment again and have a quick look. And everything's looking very cool. I'm happy with the angle of that sun. So I'm going to quickly put my volumetric clouds back on just so it's not blinding us. And now we can play with some other types of light. So if we go back to our quick add menu, the next type of light we're going to look at is the point light. So I'm going to import one of these into my scene. And now it's imported just in front of my camera. I'm going to move it a bit closer to my cube so we can see what's happening. Cool. So with the point light, it emits light from the origin. So from the very, very center, which is where this little bulb icon is that we can see. Now it will only emit light as far as the spheres around it go. So these little circles of blue that go in every axis, this is called the attenuation radius, or some people call it the fall off. So if we go to our details panel just behind my head, and we scroll down and look for the attenuation radius just here, it's currently set to 1000. If I set that higher, we'll see those circles get bigger, and the light can spread as far as those circles depending on how bright it is. But if we keep the brightness the same and make it a lot smaller, we'll see when it gets to the edge of that light, it starts to cut off where the light can go. And that is a good way to control where you do and don't want light to hit, is always make the attenuation radius only just big enough for what it needs to be. It also helps with performance if we are doing something in real time for virtual production. Of course, with the new thing we looked at for the next version of Unreal called Mega Lights, this is going to be less of an optimization problem, but it's a good thing to be aware of for now before we get into that next version of Unreal. Now, a good time to start comparing these shadows is probably about now. So if I up the intensity, we can now see from the sun, we've got this long shadow which stays parallel to each other on either side. Whereas with the point light, because it is emitting from one central position and it's not a parallel light, we can see that both of these lines from the shadow come out at an angle. And that's the easiest way to compare a point light, so something that is omnidirectional, so comes out from the center, and something that is parallel, so a parallel light that only goes in one direction. And it creates different types of shadow. So if you ever want to play with shadow and you want to do something very creative with it, it's a good thing to know how these lights work and how you can use them to your own advantage. Awesome. So this is the point light. We've messed with the attenuation radius. I upped the intensity just for the example. But now let's change the color of the light. So in the details panel just here, we can see the light color is currently set to white. If we click in that white box, we just get a generic color picker, the same as you'd see in Photoshop or any other desktop application. So we can drag that to be wherever we want it to be, and it will change to that color. So I'm just going to make mine purple for now, a nice purple color. And we've got a cool little purple light that's casting a shadow in a different direction to our sun. Awesome. Now, I'm going to quickly reset this back to white and show you something else. So if you ever want to reset something back to its default settings in Unreal Engine, once you change a setting, we'll get this tiny little arrow that looks like a back arrow or an undo arrow. And that will reset back to its default property. So we've gone back to white. Now, in our light, we also have something called use temperature. And this refers to color temperature. So if I tick this use temperature box, it enables the temperature setting. And if I drag the value up higher, we're going to notice it gets a colder light. It's almost like the lights you'd find in a hospital or fluorescent lights that are very, very harsh. If we bring that temperature down, it will start to get warmer and warmer, and it starts to go more orange and sort of hues of red, which is sometimes what we want. So if you were ever on set and you had to match the color temperature of a light, which is what studio lights are often measured in, this is the best way to do it. So on the back of most studio lights, you can set a color temperature of, let's say, something similar to daylight, which is 5600 in temperature. Press enter, and now that is roughly the color temperature of daylight with the sun. If we wanted a warmer light, which we knew that our studio light was set to, let's say, 4000 Kelvin, which is what it's measured in, we can set that and we get a much warmer light that sort of blends nicer with sunlight. Cool. So these settings apply to pretty much all of the lights we're going to look at just now. So we'll just go over the basic settings of the last few lights. So if we go back to our add menu, go to lights, and then go to spotlight, we can see in the spotlight that attenuation radius, instead of being a circle or a sphere around the point light, this time we get it in a cone. So as you'd imagine from a point light that goes just out in the one direction that the point light is facing, this cone goes out whichever way the light is facing. And you can always tell because there's a little arrow that comes out the front of it. So if we rotate this a little bit so we can see the edge of the cone, cool. And now move it close to the floor so we can see what that light's doing. Now the attenuation radius on this one, again, it will just control how far that light can affect, and depending on the intensity, it may go further, it may not go as far. We've got light color, we've got use temperature, etc, etc. But this time we've got the outer cone angle. Now the outer cone is the default blue cone that we see, and if we change that, that cone will start to get smaller and smaller so we can have a more focused light. But we also have this time an inner cone angle. It's currently set to 0, and if I change it, we're going to have a new sort of visual indicator. So if we change this up, there we go. We get a darker blue cone appear inside. Now, if I point this at the ground, we should be able to see what happens when I change that inner cone angle, if I set this up properly. So the inner cone angle currently is fairly small. If we set it to bigger and bigger, we'll see everything within that big or that inner cone angle is set to be basically 100% of the light. There is no fall off. If we make it smaller and there's distance between the inner cone and the outer cone, that is where the fall off begins. So we can see there's a smooth roll off here, and if we make it bigger again, very harsh cut off around that edge. So something to be aware of if you're trying to make spotlights for some sort of museum environment, or maybe any other environment that is man-made, something that we'd probably find these sorts of harsh spotlights in. That inner cone angle can really help to get rid of some of the fall off and give it a harsher look. Cool, so that is our spotlight. Now, the next light we are going to look at is the rect light, or rectangular light. So this light is probably the most accurate to what you'd find in a real studio. and if we manage to get over to one of the studio spaces at some point, we'll be able to compare it to that. Now, the rect light, when you bring it in, is basically two yellow squares that are attached to each other. Now, the inner yellow square is where the light should be coming from, and the outer yellow square is representing something called a barn door. So if you've ever seen studio lights before, you'll probably remember that they have these weird little flappy bits just on the outside of the light. So the idea is, as we close those, we sort of stop light from shining at too harsh an angle. So if I move this closer to the ground, so the light is a bit harsher, and then come down to our details panel. So we've got attenuation radius again, which we can see with those spheres. But this time, we've got something called barn door angle and barn door length. So the angle is currently 88, so I'm going to bring that down, and we can see that yellow square starts to come in front of the inner square. And as we move it, we can see the change in the effect of the light. Now, if this isn't cutting off enough light for what we want, we can change the barn door length to be higher. And we can see how it starts to cut things off. So these two things combined can be very useful in guiding our light to make sure it only goes a certain distance, or that it has that desired look that we want. Sometimes though, we might just keep the barn door fully open and fairly small, and we might just use this as an extra little bit of lighting for a small area if we just want to boost that light a little bit and make things more visible. I usually find this is the most realistic light to work with. I've used this in projects before to mimic the moonlight. When the moon wasn't quite bright enough and making it brighter made the entire environment too bright, I've put this behind trees, set the brightness really, really high, set it to a very cold color temperature like the moon, and it's put a really, really nice effect of highlights on the edge of leaves and sort of reflecting on those trees. So you can use this for all sorts of different things, and it can give a really, really nice effect. Cool, so that pretty much covers what we went over in the first lesson. So we've got our point light, or our directional light, sorry, which is the sun. Then we have our point light down here, which is an omnidirectional light and comes out every direction. Next we have the spotlight, which only goes in the direction that we point it. And then we have the rectangular light, which has barn doors and mimics a real studio light the best. If you need to go back and watch this again, feel free. If you already feel you know all this stuff, I'm never going to ask you to watch all these things over and over again. But if you ever need any help with anything, you can still ask in lessons. I'm not going to just point you to these videos. So feel free to ask me any questions you have, and you can always look back at these videos. This will be part of a playlist where I'm going to go over pretty much everything that we've gone over in lessons. So the next video will be going over how to make a landscape and how to set it up with the default lighting that we want. This video was probably a bit rambly. I've not recorded tutorial videos like this for a very long time, so I will try and keep the next one sort of much shorter, much more succinct, so you can always just click on the video and very quickly find out what it is you want to find out. And hopefully these will help you in making some really, really cool environments. Thanks guys.